Greetings, ladies and gents, and welcome to this latest edition of Read where I take old stories I've narrated and update them to modern audio standards. This particular story is called Sky of Fire, written by jormundr. For as long as I, at least, could remember, warfare on the galactic scale took place only with ships. Holding a planet with anything of value required having a fleet to defend it, or taking massive casualties and having facilities, compounds, or factories destroyed in the orbital bombardment. Planetary-based defenses existed, but only to assist with fleet coordination and supplement firepower in the defense. Then the humans were contacted. Crude methods and heavy construction. Where the avian Kethra had ships of speed and grace, humans were ponderously slow and brutish. Their fighters could not match the number of the hive fleets of the Chakari, or the brute force of my race, the Evrish. It wouldn't have made a difference, but their armor was far beneath that of the Heroth, whose own bodies were heavily carapaced. The only thing they had was durability. The constructions they made could have failure after cascading failure and still managed to work. Warfare was the status quo of the universe that the humans stumbled into. Each race would raid, pillage, destroy, and replace from each other. Negotiations happened, but usually out of convenience and never for more than simple shared goals. I don't know a single race that didn't laugh when the humans sent their messages of peace. They were attacked by everyone at small incursions, the hazing ritual of the universe. We laughed again as we destroyed their pitiful fleets, frustrated only in the time it took for their ships to finally die. We scoffed as we took the wreckage in an effort to learn their technology and saw they had an absolute nothing to give. Redundancy and support structures, lack of faith in their own technology. But even worse, they had numerous landing vessels, drop pods, a prisoner explained, to place soldiers on the ground, land vehicles and atmo-restricted aircraft, even amphibious vehicles that are supposed to travel land and liquid bodies. Here was a race that didn't understand warfare, the economy, or price. So we left them alone after that, treating attacks from them in the same way a star defends from an asteroid. They retaliated and railed, but soon enough they grew quiet and accepted their place in the natural order. They weren't attacked only because they never had anything worth taking. When they finally stopped attacking us, we were amused they seemed to attack each other, pirates and raiders attacking human ships since they obviously didn't stand up to others. Factions within the species seemingly competed with each other, so they focused on their expansions and were ignored by the universe at large, which was the second mistake we made. After a number of cycles of being ignored, the Heroth learned of a human colony world rich in rare metals. It was a standard purge, unfortunate but common enough that nobody batted an eye. Heavy salvo orbital strikes on major settlements and then flyover bombings on minor. Enough to kill most inhabitants to prevent any rebellion from forming. Not enough to make major geological or chemical changes in the environment. It would be the last mistake in the non-combat setting that would be made with the humans. The response was immediate. Humans called out for justice, retribution, assistance, and revenge, but continued to be ignored. Their own governments forged themselves into a singular movement, and their military production swelled. It would have been impressive if they had a force that hadn't already been tested and found lacking. Reports came from the Heroth defeat at the world that they tried to claim, making them a laughingstock amongst the races. We learned that their hold had been tenuous from the start. Mining facilities and outposts attacked and sabotaged by survivors on the bombardments. Spread out and unable to be exterminated without measures that would make the world useless, and viral attacks unable to spread due to the now scattered populations. Then, in the counter-attack launched by the humans, ground forces were deployed and crippled the planetary defenses. Orbital stations desynced, and the fleet was pushed back by sheer numbers. The Heroth ships could weather attack after attack, but eventually failed as the sustained fire from so many wore down their defenses. They moved on from ships that should have been crippled or dead, only to be attacked by what should have been space garbage. The Heroth lost a few ships, but not nearly as many as the humans who had to throw almost half their fleet and heavily outnumbered the enemy to gain a single win. The Heroth retreated, counting the planets off as a loss and not worth the resources to keep. The humans didn't stop, though. By the time the next engagement happened, the Heroth had mostly forgotten about the loss, already competing for a system held by my people, and weathering our heavy weapons with their impenetrable shields. The humans hit them on a small agri-world, low resources and low priority for most. The ships in the system came, but instead of the same pitiful ships as before, the humans came with something different. They sported similar heavy defenses as the Heroth, making them even more difficult to kill as their redundant systems and structures, keeping them fighting longer than they should have. But worse was the ugly creations they'd made since their last fight. They'd learned not just from the armor of the ships left behind, but the equipment that remained from the mining operations. Heavily armored boarding ships launched and attached to the Heroth fleet and burrowed into them like insects, allowing the troops they carried to invade the ship and take it over. The galactic scene paused and noticed, for the second time, the human presence, but the attitude was entirely different. Nobody had standing armies, so using boarding parties was always seen as useful in dire or specific circumstances, not a method of attack. The Heroth was suddenly attacked on multiple fronts from humans, so much of their fleet resources having already been devoted to their preferred tactics and strategies of heavy shielding that they didn't have an immediate answer to this type of enemy and took heavy losses. They sent out a desperate plea, asking for help and negotiating dwindling resources. At first, nobody wanted to help, preferring to allow them to suffer as we picked easy battles from the thinning defenses of their worlds and systems. But a few battles, including one race or another, and the humans were hurt by the new enemy, but managed to survive or salvage enough to respond with something new the next time. Kethra ships were competing against flyers just as fast when they weren't being hampered by mines. Chithraki fleets were unable to compete with the computer drones deployed that synced more perfectly than an insect mind could. Even our fleets were hammered by the same heavy weapons we'd always been behind, salvo after salvo of devastating fire. That was only in the areas we had originally valued. The planets they conquered were taken not with bombardment, but with troops, facilities, technology, resources, scientists and personnel. Civilian populations all fell for the humans rather than be destroyed. The ground campaigns they waged were short as they wiped away meager defenses that weren't considered necessary by their enemy. And what they gained was new ways of thinking. Technology they lacked was made up for by us, and they won the hearts and minds of our own people by simply letting them live rather than writing them off as they expected. The civilians that were found and questioned always described the same thing: fear, as the sky seemed to burst into flame from the sheer number of craft, drop pods and vehicles entering the atmosphere at high speed. Hopelessness as military outposts are taken, governments are dismantled, and their lives become uncertain. And then surprise as the same soldiers that destroyed so much of their life set up schools, hospitals, and lines of communication before leaving, and daily life returned almost to how it was, just a change in management. The humans continue to wage a galactic war, winning more than they lose, and what they leave in their wake is peace. So many people who lived hard, uncertain lives of being wiped out before they knew their fleet was under attack were living prosperous lives in the human empire. I almost hope that we lose completely. End of story. I would just like to thank the T5 supporters: Bushmaster 117, Casper Arnholtz, Drexzoon WRE, Elijah Silvercross, Gray, John Carrington, and Severin Cerberus. Thank you very much.